Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with the strains of Toreador ringing in my ears. I don't know if this is the bull ring, but it is a pleasure to be in front of you now. And I'm very conscious that I am not the main attraction at 13:45 today. The main attraction is my former colleague Dominic Cummings, who's appearing in front of the COVID inquiry even as I speak. So if some of you are gazing at your telephones during my remarks, I can well understand why your attention is elsewhere. But I want to thank you for attending this conference, and I want in particular to thank two of the moving spirits who are responsible for organising the ARC conference this week, Paul Marshall and Philippa Stroud. And the reason why I want to thank Paul and Philippa is not just because in organising this conference they are bringing together people whose voices have sometimes not been heard as clearly and as profoundly as they need to be, and are also, by so doing, making sure that we as a nation and as a civilization reflect on where we've been going and where we should be going. The reason why I want to thank them is that both of them have played a critical role in some of the reforms over the course of the last 15 years that have helped the most vulnerable in our society. Philippa, when she was working at the Department of Work and Pensions, was responsible for re-engineering the UK's welfare system in order to make work pay, to give every individual dignity, and to support the vulnerable into lives more valuable. And I also want to thank Paul for his leadership. Through ARC schools, he's been responsible for bringing a high-quality classical education to children from disadvantaged backgrounds across this country. Both of them are reformers, and both of them, like so many of the great reformers of the past, like William Wilberforce, like Margaret Thatcher, have been inspired by their own personal faith to help others in need. And we need more people like Paul and like Philippa in business and in our public life, and I salute them for everything they have done and the leadership they are showing by bringing this conference together. Now, Paul invited me to say a few words about capitalism. But after Paul's speech yesterday, there's almost nothing more that I can say. He said it all. Sometimes people say to me, when I'm offering an opinion, if you're so clever, why aren't you rich? Well, as we all know with Paul, he's both extraordinarily clever and very, very rich. But from that vantage point, he knows whereof he speaks. And the case that he outlined yesterday is one that I wholeheartedly endorse. Because it is the case that capitalism has been responsible for human abundance, creativity, the enrichment of all our lives like no other force. And the thing to remember about that force, about that change, is that, as Paul reminded us, it was in the 16th and the 17th century that mankind, after years of relatively stagnant growth, not just years, not just decades, but centuries of relatively stagnant growth, mankind, civilization, experienced the most tremendous increase in wealth, in opportunity, in security. And the reason for that was not a technological breakthrough, it was a revolution in thought. In the Dutch Republic, in Great Britain, what we saw then were the fusion of particular forces coming together, as Deirdre McCluskey and Joel Mokyr have pointed out, which meant that mankind made a genuine leap forward. And at the heart of those changes were three things. The first was a recognition of the importance of the individual. You can associate it with the Reformation and Protestantism. You can associate it with the creation of institutions, the Royal Society, the Bank of England, accountable parliaments. And you can associate it also with the emergence of democratic nation states. The Netherlands, Great Britain at that time, the United Provinces, our parliament, all of them were shaped by the fact that you had a community of people who held power accountable, who believed in free thought and believed in the robustness of institutions. Now, all of those factors are key ingredients in the success of capitalism, and all of those factors have been under attack in recent decades. Individual conscience and freedom, institutional resilience and strength, national democracy and accountability. They have all been under attack, and they all need to be defended and upheld if we're to have the future of abundance that this conference is dedicated to providing. But if we're going to look at why capitalism is under threat and under challenge, why creativity, accountability, national resilience are challenged at the moment, then we need to recognize what those forces are that have worked against the growth and the creativity that we are all here to cherish. And I think it's important that we recognize that there are at least two factors, at least two trends that over the last few decades have worked against the success of capitalism and support for it, particularly amongst the young. The first has been the behavior of the privileged, and the second has been the success of our biggest growth industry in the world. The behavior of the privileged, first of all. One of the things that we've seen, and as Paul pointed out yesterday, it was predicted by Joseph Schumpeter in the middle of the last century, is that we have seen a concentration of wealth, a tendency towards monopoly and oligopoly that has meant that the gains of economic growth have increasingly been concentrated in the hands of a few. The behavior of asset managers and the way in which they are looking always for a return on investment and not on proper stewardship of their assets. The way in which, during the last 10 years, quantitative easing has seen those with assets, seen the value of those assets inflated already, while others have endured inflation so that the ordinary costs of living have only grown. The way in which those organizations, those corporates that have an interest in regulatory capture have used their size, their lobbying ability, and their closeness and proximity to power to essentially rig markets in their favor and to block the insurgents from providing both the growth and the innovation that our economy needs. On top of that, we've also seen globalization, which, while it's brought huge gains in its first phase, in its latter phases has been experienced by so many of our citizens as a reinforcement of inequality, as those with cognitive ability and connections benefit disproportionately, and the poorer in our society, particularly in concentrated communities, fall behind. On top of that, as Constance Kissen reminded us, we've also had a particular problem for those of us who are believers in the widespread ownership of capital. We've had a particular problem in our housing markets. It's particularly acute in this country, but not restricted to the United Kingdom. It's a feature of most developed economies, particularly in the Anglophone world. Two factors have been particularly at work. Financialization in the housing market, which has seen housing and property used increasingly as an asset against which banks are happy to lend and which people are delighted to invest in because of the guaranteed return it brings, and housing, rather than being seen principally as a means of providing people with shelter and a means by which families can grow, is seen as a tradable asset. And on top of that, the way in which in particular communities the drawbridge has been pulled up, and those who already enjoy housing wealth have wanted to see that wealth preserved and the amenities that they enjoy preserved by restricting new development. All of these factors together have meant that those who have been privileged, those who already have significant assets, those who are smart and connected, have been able to enrich themselves at a rate that has only exacerbated inequality and therefore led to resentment. And that brings me to my second factor, which causes problems for capitalism today. I talked about the most successful industry in the world. The world's biggest manufacturing concern. The most successful industry in the world is the resentment industry. What it does is manufacture grievance. And one of the things, again, that Schumpeter predicted is that we would see, as our societies became wealthier, the growth of a class, a group, a set of individuals and institutions that resented the way in which capitalism operated and sought to corral and to control it, and also to strike at the roots of its success. And one of the particular challenges that those of us who believe in capitalism and in free enterprise and in economic growth face is that we now face, in many areas, an effective coalition between the privileged and the resentment industry. How does that take place? What form does it take? You will find that there are major figures, major institutions within the corporate world who are well aware that the decisions that they've taken have enriched them, that carried interest, that the way in which asset managers operate have meant that they have done incredibly well out of the division of spoils in our country. And they're also conscious that they need to insulate themselves from the envy, resentment, and indeed sense of injustice that is out there. So what they've done is they've co-opted individuals from the resentment industry to be their advisors on ESG, EDI, or whatever other acronymic shield they wish to put up. And of course, all of us here care about the environment. We want to make sure that corporate governance is reformed. We want to see genuine diversity. We want to see inclusivity in our societies. We want to see a greater sense of equality. But what so many of those engaged in this enterprise are doing is creating codes, setting up structures, operating in a way that works against the innovation that we want to see, but also doesn't address some of the profound inequalities that exist within our society. So the EDI industry doesn't always go, put it mildly, for diversity of thought or genuine diversity of background. And when we're addressing equality and inequality, sometimes there are performative exercises about boardroom composition that they go through, but what they rarely do is think hard about the impact on working people in industry who often find that their participation in the labor market, their sense of economic security, their sense of agency has been undermined and denied. Globalization, while it has brought many huge benefits, has also brought a sense of economic insecurity that we all have a responsibility to address if we're going to ensure that there is a democratic basis and popular support for a free enterprise system. So what is the answer? Well, it was the case that Leo Strauss, one of the greatest thinkers of the last century, said that for civilization to survive, we need to look back at what Athens and Jerusalem gave us. And I agree. What we need is both the Promethean spirit that grabs fire from the gods and the rabbinical sense of obligation to our culture, our tradition, and to our brothers and sisters. What do I mean by that Promethean spirit? We once again need to have an economic system that is on the side of the insurgent, the entrepreneur, the creative, and the questioner. And we can only have an economic culture that favors that if we have a broader intellectual culture that is in favor of free speech, free inquiry, and challenge. So as Constantine and others have reminded us, economics and culture are inextricably interlinked. You can only have a successful free market economy that favors the insurgent and the creator and those who generate value and innovation if you also have a culture free of cancellation, free of censorship, free of the marginalization of those who wish to challenge what is the current consensus. The two go together. But as well as that Promethean spirit, we also need to have a fealty to what I would call a rabbinical spirit as well. What do I mean by that? I mean, in particular, a belief that you need to take inequality seriously. Individual freedom is only meaningful in the context of relationships and communities. It is only through communion with others that we are made whole. It is only by knowing our history and our tradition and how we are situated within it that our lives and the lives of others are given true meaning. And it is only through the exercise of compassion in everything that we do that value, transcendent and enduring value, is genuinely added. Now, it doesn't require you to have any sort of religious faith to subscribe to and to appreciate the importance of that tradition. But what that tradition embodies is a recognition that the accumulation of wealth for its own sake, the worship of gain, is empty plutocracy, vulgar and immoral. But the generation of wealth, because you believe in providing employment, you believe in generating abundance, you want to be in a position to see philanthropy bloom, you want your nation and your country to grow stronger, that is something worth celebrating. That is something worth applauding. And that takes me to my final point. For those charged with the exercise of political or economic power, I think accountability is key. So I talked earlier about the need to look at corporate governance, and I think we should, because we need to make sure that those who exercise decisions on the part of those who have capital at their disposal, we need to make sure that there is an appropriate means of those individuals being held to account, that agents and managers' interests are aligned. But more than that, we need political accountability as well. And that is why I think the importance of the nation state matters so much. Yoram Hazony has, in his masterful works, drawn the distinction which has existed throughout history between nations and empires. Empires have advantages. Empires can bring freedom of movement and freedom of commerce over a larger expanse. But what they lack, what they always lack, is the link between those exercising power and those in whose name and in whose interests that power is exercised. The great thing about nation states is that they ensure not just that power is accountable, but also that we're prepared to make sacrifices for others. We're prepared to see our taxes spent. We're prepared to see our children wear uniforms and to defend our values. We're prepared to recognize that there is a community of interests larger than ourselves. And that is why I think as ARC continues its work, as this conference and this movement continues its work, we should always seek to recognize that it is within the boundaries of a nation state and through the institutions of a nation state that we can best harness that Promethean spirit of enterprise and at the same time also incarnate that tradition of solidarity, compassion, and care. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to quit the stage and hand over to our next speaker and say simply, I am so grateful to Philippa, to Paul, to Jordan, and others for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts with you, but more importantly, for launching this arc on troubled seas, because I know it is through this arc that we will find a sure home. Thank you.